ago. Where do evolutionists get this idea of 200,000 years? Well, this does not come from genetics itself. This comes from looking at the geologic time scale for the evolution of humanity and then applying it to genetics. Well, we just mentioned a few minutes ago that mitochondrial DNA acts like a clock. Every so often there's mistakes that are made. Could we use the genetic data to try to arrive at a conclusion for when the beginning was? And in fact, you can do this sort of experiment. You can get mothers and daughters, grandmothers and granddaughters, get the mitochondrial DNA from each of them, and then count the number of differences. It's really pretty straightforward. And then it tells you how fast or slow this mitochondrial DNA copying process, mistake process occurs. Is it the slow ticking of what evolutionists invoke, or is it pretty fast, more like the ticking of a stopwatch? How far back in history did this mitochondrial DNA ancestor live? Well, let's look at what the evolutionists said. One of the earliest studies to try to measure this was just a few decades ago. In 1997, the commentary on this was written in Science magazine in early 1998. And Ann Gibbons, the author, said researchers have calculated that mitochondrial Eve, that's the evolutionary Eve that we just mentioned, the woman whose mtDNA or mitochondrial DNA was ancestral to that in all living people, lived 100,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa. So that sentence is referring to the application of evolutionary geology to the genetic family tree we just discussed. Now, this is what she goes on to say, using the new mitochondrial DNA clock. So she's referring now to one of the first attempts to count the number of differences between mothers and daughters, grandmothers and granddaughters. Using the new information, she would be a mere 6,000 years old. Well, doesn't that sound familiar? No one thinks that's the case. Well, why does no one think that's the case in mainstream science? Because it disagrees with evolution. Now, I've published several papers taking all the data that's been accumulated over the last several decades and showing that the original conclusion, mitochondrial Eve living just 6,000 years ago, still holds true. This is something you can directly infer from a straightforward interpretation of the genetic evidence. So not only does the Bible indicate that Eve, mitochondrial Eve, lived 6,000 years ago, looking at straightforward science, there she is. There's the echo. I want to focus specifically here now on what they say about the time scale, because this is something we can test scientifically. In our last episode, we said the mitochondrial time scale is not derived directly from genetics. They take it from evolutionary geology, apply it directly and stretch the family tree of humanity over that time scale and assume that it must be 200,000 years. They do the same thing for the Y chromosome family tree. They say, here's all these differences. We know from geology, archaeology, it must take a long time. So we're going to stretch out this whole tree, plant it in Africa, assume common ancestry. That's how they do it. Well, the way you test whether or not this matches up with reality in a scientific sense is you get fathers and sons and you directly count how many mistakes are made every generation. And this story is even more wild than the story we examined for mitochondrial DNA. Truth is stranger than fiction. Again, the principle is there's mistakes that occur. Well, what? Every generation, every few generations? No one knows until you directly measure it by getting dad's Y chromosome, son's Y chromosome, grandpa's Y chromosome, grandson's Y chromosome. So the story and the way this is played out for the Y chromosome, these sorts of studies were performed beginning in 2009. There was an initial study in 2009, then another one in 2015. They were based on low quality data, low quality DNA, but the results that they concluded, the rate of errors, the rate of mutations that they empirically discovered was slow, and it fit their expectations for 200,000 years. And when I initially saw these papers, I wasn't quite sure what to do with them. Well, you wait, and two subsequent studies were done, also one in 2015, one in 2017, based on high quality DNA. And what they discovered and what they did with it is, again, stuff you can't make up. It's the same paper that I showed earlier, dealing with and showing the global family tree of humanity. Their global family tree of humanity has, I think, accurate branches. But what they included as part of their study was a set of father-son pairs as a check on their work to make sure what they were doing was accurate. And if you look at the main text of the paper, they say we found a rate that's consistent with evolution. If you look at the supplemental information, where they actually tell you the details of how they arrived at that conclusion, it gets really wild. So here's a direct quote from their paper. They said, again, looking at these father-son comparisons, where they were trying to check their experiments to make sure they were working, they said the number of father-son Y chromosome differences, mutations, was approximately 10-fold higher than the expected number, considering the range of published Y chromosome mutation or copying mistake rates. And if you look at what they were referring to about the published rates, they're talking about the previous low quality attempts that gave results consistent with evolution. In other words, they said, we discovered something unexpected. When we used high quality DNA, we discovered a rate that was much higher than what evolution predicts. And here's what I've highlighted in red. This finding prompted us to explore additional filters. What they literally did was filter out data that contradicted the expectations of evolution. They took their high quality DNA that gave results that I'll show you in a minute were consistent with the Bible. They said, even though this is high quality DNA, it's better data, it doesn't fit evolution, therefore we've got to filter out stuff that doesn't fit. You can't make this stuff up. These are smart people, but they're bound by the framework of evolution. And the bottom line is both of these subsequent studies fit exactly the biblical expectations. And I put here 4,500 years ago.
So Dr. Jensen, how often does that happen with a lot of other research that's being done?
My impression is when you're dealing with science in which the worldview component is minor, when we're dealing with questions of the present, does this particular drug cure cancer? Or here's a very relevant one, does this particular drug cure the coronavirus? These are questions of the present that don't really require you to make some statement about the past. And so by and large, those sorts of results are done rationally. They're done with an eye to the data. They're done rigorously to say, does the data fit expectations? Does it actually cure patients? Should we give them true hope? Is it false hope? That sort of discussion tends to be reliable. Of course, if it's coming out of communist China, where we already have evidence that things are being suppressed, another story. I'm talking about Western science. However, anytime you touch on the question of origins, what you see time and time again is the conclusions must match the evolutionary framework. For some reason, all this sort of rationality gets thrown to the curb, and the data is forced to conform and fit the preconceived notions. Again, you can't make this up. You say, and I've worked with people here, I know personally evolutionists, and I know they're smart people, and you say, why are you doing this? Why? This is obviously not something that's rational. Why are you forcing the better data to fit the bad data solely for the purpose of confirming evolution? And it is, well, we know as Christians why this is occurring. But again, you can't make this up. This is literally what you can find documented in their own papers.
Yeah, it's an irrational prejudice because of the heart of man. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
You can't ignore the spiritual state of things.